Good afternoon. The I-900 Subcommittee Public Hearing will come to order, as I promised you about an hour ago that it would. Today, the State Auditor will be presenting their recent report, Community Engagement During Contaminated Site Cleanups. Staff from the State Auditor's Office will give a presentation on their recent performance audit. The performance audit being discussed at this hearing was conducted solely and independently by the State Auditor's Office under the authority of legislation approved by the voters in Initiative 900. The State Auditor is elected directly by the people of the state of Washington and operates independently of the legislature and thus independently of the Joint Legislative Audit and Review Committee. JLARC members attending virtually can let me know during the presentation if they have questions by using the raise hand feature, or just wave your hand up in the air and I'll see you. We will be taking public testimony after the presentation, and staff have supplied information on registering for in-person and remote public testimony via Zoom on the JLARC website. So we do have staff here and we do have agency personnel that are available to answer questions. With that, let's launch right into it. Carolyn Cato and Marissa Sanchez-Reed from the State Auditor's Office, welcome. Please proceed when you're ready.
Thank you, and members of the, thank you to you, and also thank you to members of the committee. For everyone here today, thank you for taking time to hear about the Office of the Washington State Auditor's report on community engagement efforts that occur during contaminated site cleanup. My name is Marissa Sanchez-Reed, and I'm a staff auditor who worked on the audit. Joining me today is Carolyn Cato, who led the audit. We'd like to thank the Department of Ecology and the Department of Health for their time and responsiveness throughout the audit. During this audit, we found that Ecology manages only 8% of Washington's contaminated sites. This leaves the majority of sites without any requirements for community engagement. For the sites Ecology does manage, the agency followed many required and leading practices, but community experiences varied widely. Further, we met with and surveyed tribal governments. Some said Ecology's level of engagement met their needs, while others said they need more engagement and that engagement needs to happen earlier in the cleanup process. This audit is important because chemicals and toxic substances can contaminate soil, water, and air, which can make places unsafe for people to live or work. Generally, the state assigns primary oversight and management responsibilities for cleanup of these sites to the Department of Ecology. Another reason this audit is important is because contaminated sites are primarily concentrated in communities with vulnerable populations and can lead to worse health outcomes for the people living there. Throughout this presentation, when we talk about vulnerable populations, we're talking about communities that are at higher risk for poor health outcomes in response to environmental harms due to several factors, such as the lack of access to resources in a specific language or disproportionate unemployment rates. Working collaboratively with communities to repair past harms is an important part of environmental justice, one of Washington State's ways of addressing unequal treatment over time. During this audit, we answered 3 questions. What engagement approaches does Ecology use when working with communities affected by contaminated site cleanup efforts? Does Ecology tailor its approaches to meet the specific needs of each community? And does Ecology consistently and equitably gather, consider, and integrate feedback from affected communities into its cleanup efforts? The Model Toxics Control Act is the primary state law governing contaminated sites in Washington. The law and its associated regulations specify how Ecology should carry out cleanups and work with communities affected by sites, how and when to notify tribes and the public about cleanup, and when Ecology must provide the public with the opportunity to comment on site cleanup. At this point, it's important to note there are different processes for how agencies must engage with the public and for how agencies must engage with tribal nations. These differences exist because there is a government-to-government relationship between state governments and tribal governments. The Model Toxics Control Act identifies 3 types of site cleanups: ecology-conducted sites, which are sites where Ecology cleans up the site; ecology-supervised sites. These sites, Ecology supervises the work being conducted by the site's owner or other liable person under a legal agreement; and independent sites, which are sites where a property owner or developer conducts site cleanup without technical assistance or supervision from Ecology. Before we get into the audit results, I want to mention that we found an underlying issue we did not expect. Ecology is currently responsible for conducting or overseeing engagement activities for a small fraction of the active cleanup sites listed on the agency's website. I'll be talking about this issue next, and then Carolyn will pick back up on what we learned about community and tribal engagement efforts at sites that Ecology does have oversight of. With that, let's get started. Our team reviewed the list of active contaminated sites and found that as of August 2024, only 493 sites were conducted or supervised by Ecology. This means only people affected by these contaminated sites will receive the community engagement and feedback opportunities set out in the regulations for the Model Toxics Control Act. Ecology's rules under the Model Toxics Control Act allow third parties to perform cleanups. Our analysis of Ecology's data showed that the vast majority of cleanup sites are managed by independent third parties. As a reminder, independent cleanups are not subject to the community engagement requirements that apply to Ecology-conducted or supervised sites. Further, Ecology isn't required to provide feedback or oversight of the third party's engagement efforts. Because Ecology does not oversee community engagement activities for sites managed by third parties, it lacks community engagement information for these sites, including information about third-party managed sites that may be near vulnerable populations. Our data analysis found that of third-party managed sites, 212 were ranked by Ecology as high-risk or moderate high-risk sites. The agency has not performed or overseen community engagement activities at any of them because they have been managed by a third party. As a note, in our analysis, we did not evaluate which of these high and moderate high-risk sites are located near vulnerable populations. Some independent sites fall under the voluntary cleanup program. Under this program, owners of contaminated sites who conduct independent cleanups can receive technical assistance and written opinions on the sufficiency of the site cleanup from Ecology for a fee. It's important to point out that Ecology has no oversight authority over community or tribal engagement at voluntary cleanup program sites. Of the sites listed on Ecology's website, 1,598 are not managed by anyone. This accounts for about a quarter of all active sites. In addition, our analysis found that 125 planless sites have been ranked as either high risk or moderate high risk. These sites are planless because Ecology is transitioning from using one scoring method to another. Until Ecology managers know how sites are scored under the new method, it's challenging for the managers to decide how the sites should be cleaned up. Sometimes it's hard to visualize what we're talking about when we say things such as high or moderate high risk sites, so I want to provide an example. This waterfront location on Bainbridge Island was once a strawberry canning plant. Site studies found arsenic, lead, and mercury had contaminated both soil and groundwater. This site is listed on Ecology's website as being cleaned up by an independent third party, which means Ecology has not overseen public outreach or community engagement at this site. There are several reasons why community engagement is important. Community engagement helps make sure the public is better informed. It helps obtain buy-in and support. It reduces conflicts and increases public confidence in decisions. And it allows people affected by the cleanup to share their concerns and the historical knowledge they have with the agency. When hazardous sites are located near marginalized communities, the risk of inequity increases because their voices are even less likely to be heard. Third parties don't have any incentives for adequately engaging communities or tribes that live or work near waste sites because there are no requirements for how third parties must engage communities and for who would provide oversight of that work. Also, third parties can benefit from not allocating time and spending money on engaging communities throughout the cleanup process. Further, people with fewer resources may find it challenging to hold third parties legally responsible if contamination causes illness or other harm. The Healthy Environment for All Act was designed to reduce environmental and health disparities among all state residents. It directs Ecology to develop a plan for how the agency will facilitate meaningful, equitable, and direct involvement of vulnerable populations, and for cleanups that affect federally recognized tribes, the Act requires a consultation framework that includes best practices and protocols for communication and collaboration. This Act also promotes removing engagement barriers, such as accounting for transportation challenges that could make it harder for community members to participate in meetings, or using plain talk when communicating with the public. I'd like to talk about another community engagement requirement related to collaboration between the Department of Ecology and the Department of Health. The Department of Health has access to multiple channels that can help Ecology inform community members about human health risks at cleanup sites, specifically because of its relationships with local health departments. Poor communication between Ecology and Health could lead to the latter agency not knowing its help is needed. Also, poor collaboration could mean that important information about health hazards is incorrect or does not reach the desired audiences. We interviewed agency managers at both Ecology and Health and found that despite collaboration's importance, the agencies do not do so consistently. Agency collaborative efforts appeared to be informal. Both agencies said Health does get involved to help with community engagement when there are known health risks, but Health's involvement depends entirely on whether an Ecology site manager knows to contact its staff. And staff guidance and training appeared minimal. At present, Ecology lacks clear policies or guidance that specifically addresses when staff must or should collaborate with health or local health departments. With that, I'm going to hand it over to Carolyn to talk about Ecology's community and tribal engagement efforts at a sample of sites.
Thank you, Marisa. My name is Carolyn Cato, and next we will cover the results of the site evaluations we conducted. Overall, we found that Ecology met most legal requirements for community engagement activities, but we did identify one area for improvement. This is the first legal requirement on the slide, researching communities surrounding the site at the start of a cleanup. This practice has two components to help Ecology decide how best to engage with the surrounding communities. First, researching community demographics, and second, contacting local organizations and agencies. We found that for all 6 sites, Ecology had researched the community demographics. However, Ecology was inconsistent in its methods for engaging with local community organizations and agencies to learn more about the specific needs of the community. Next, we evaluated 5 leading practices to assess how Ecology is engaging with the surrounding communities. In several cases, the practice was not applicable or the agency did not use it. For example, having a virtual option for a meeting when Ecology was not required to hold a public meeting. We did note one area of improvement that stood out in particular when reviewing the leading practices. This was the last leading practice on the slide, conducting a lessons learned evaluation to identify improvements needed in the community engagement process. We found the agency lacked a systematic process to evaluate the effectiveness of its outreach activities. Only 2 of the 6 sites evaluated had conducted evaluations of the community engagement activities. As part of the audit, we also spoke with representatives from community organizations to learn more about their experiences with ecology. We conducted 2 focus groups, and participants identified 3 areas that ecology could improve upon. First, ecology was slow to engage the local community early enough in the process. Early engagement can inform people of the risks posed by the contaminated site so that they can take precautions. It also allows community members to comment on the proposed cleanup actions before the agency's plans are solidified. Second, there was limited access to information in preferred languages. Ecology currently translates documents like fact sheets or public notices that describe what is occurring and the potential hazards if the non-English speaking population reaches a certain threshold. However, the agency does not currently translate technical documents due to the volume of material and the associated costs, but indicated they would do so if requested. The final area related to generic rather than tailored engagement. During our interviews, we learned that ecology does not always appear to do the work necessary to encourage participation, to include being more in tune where community members already typically gather. Doing so would allow them to share information and receive feedback from community members. Next, we looked at ecology's engagement with tribal governments and the unique requirements the agency is required to follow under the Model Toxic Control Act. The new regulation for tribal engagement requires ecology to engage tribes separately and in addition to public engagement. This is because of the government-to-government relationship between state governments and tribal governments. Ecology is also required to develop a tribal engagement plan for each site that identifies which tribes may be affected by the site and how best to communicate with each tribe. In addition, ecology is required to start engaging with the tribes before initiating a remedial investigation or interim action at the site. The new regulation requires ecology to provide tribes with timely information, effective communication, and continuous opportunities for collaboration. We conducted a focus group and online survey with tribal representatives to learn about their experiences with ecology. We asked similar questions in both the focus group and the online survey. 3 tribes participated in the focus group and 5 responded to the survey. It is important to note that the overall results we will share on the next 2 slides are only reflective of the tribes who participated. We did not receive responses from every tribal nation. Next, we will cover the overall results for 3 questions we asked tribal representatives. The first question, does ecology's current level of engagement meet your tribe's needs? Most participants said that ecology's level of engagement met their tribe's needs. The second question, have ecology's engagement efforts been equitable? Responses varied for this one. Tribal representatives for 3 tribes felt ecology's engagement efforts had been equitable, while 3 others indicated it had not been, and the remaining 2 indicated they did not know. The third question, does ecology contact your tribe early enough in the process? Most participants said ecology's early engagement efforts met their tribe's needs. The fourth question we asked is, do you see opportunities for improvement regarding ecology's engagement efforts? We identified 2 areas for improvement based upon the feedback from tribal representatives. The first one is to ensure all staff understand how to identify affected tribes. The second one is to ensure all staff understand how to tailor the engagement plan for each tribe. Ecology is already making changes to address new legal requirements that will establish clear expectations for site managers and staff. The agency is working on implementing a tribal engagement plan template that will make it clear what staff are legally required to do during tribal engagement. We made a series of recommendations to the Department of Ecology. to address a lack of community engagement activities at independent sites that are high or moderate risk sites, to establish a proactive plan for evaluating the highest risk sites that do not have a cleanup plan yet, and to further improve community and tribal engagement at site cleanups conducted or supervised by Ecology. We also made recommendations to both Ecology and Health to address inconsistent coordination between Ecology and Health to work together to develop training about collaboration between the two agencies. This concludes our presentation, and we're happy to answer any questions that you may have.
Okay, thank you for the presentation. I do have a question to start out. I'm not really understanding how Ecology is not involved in some of the cleanups that are going on. It seems to me that if anybody's doing a cleanup, they would have had to have gotten some sort of a permit. Generally, they're cleaning up because they're doing construction of a new site, a new building of some sort. And that would have to go through, I would think, have to go through the SEPA process. And Ecology would be consulted on that. And there's also a public review. So I'm a little confused about the 3,651 sites that are managed by a third party, and there's no public engagement and apparently no oversight by Department of Ecology. That just kind of confuses me.
Thank you for that question, Representative Orchid. Yes, when we were looking at this, when this audit specifically focuses on strictly community engagement, and so we did not look at this from a lens of the cleanup process itself, but as far as the community engagement aspect of this, when we looked at this and the sites that they are actually responsible for being engaged with community engagement, there are these sites with the third party, managed by the third parties, that do not have oversight from Ecology with the community engagement. The cleanup process was not within the scope of this audit, and so that is the difference there with this.
So these cleanups may be under permit that the Department of Ecology has reviewed and approved, but they just didn't do community outreach?
That is correct, and I will defer to Ecology to speak to that further, but for the purposes of the scope of our audit, we focus strictly in on community engagement and what they are required to do and not required to do, and so that is where the focus of our audit is here. Okay.
Representative Paulette, did you have a question?
I do, I appreciate Representative Orcutt's question because I was also surprised about the failure to discuss SEPA because it has extensive public involvement requirements and all cleanups are subject to SEPA review. Something you said in the presentation and echoed in the report itself, I mean, first off, let me just say I think that this is incredibly important given the thousands of contaminated sites in the state, and that I really appreciated that the state auditor's office didn't just say, oh, we're only going to look at this very narrow set of sites, but we're going to broaden and look at all the sites, the majority of sites in the state that are not even under Ecology's direct action program. So the, quote, independent or voluntary cleanup sites, many of which are sitting with no action. So thank you for doing that, but I was very concerned about the implication from your comment and in the report that Ecology has no oversight over those private, independent, voluntary sites for purposes of public involvement. And the MOTCA itself has extensive authority to Ecology to provide and oversee and require potentially liable persons to conduct remedial actions, and that includes public involvement plans. And to require them to do that or to charge the potentially liable party for conducting public involvement. And I know both tribes, especially tribes, have sued over failure to have participation costs as part of the response costs incurred by a tribe. So can you explain why, do you disagree that Ecology has authority to require extensive public involvement, but just simply isn't requiring public involvement plans?
So when we looked at the actual requirements in the laws, and I just want to speak to the question about SEPA before. So we did not look at that part of the process as part of the cleanup process. So we didn't, that was an area that we reviewed. What we did look at was what they're required to do when they're cleaning up this and communicating with the surrounding communities that are affected. What we found is that the law requires Ecology for those sites that they actually supervise or where they conduct the actual cleanup. On those sites, they're required to conduct community engagement activities. But on the sites that are overseen by third parties, where they actually are going in and doing the cleanup, that they do not have to do the community engagement. They only are required to notify the community about the cleanup, but beyond that, the more extensive community engagement that is involved that Ecology currently does with the sites that they are involved in, that does not necessarily always occur with third parties. Now, we didn't look at this as far as what third parties do, so there is a potential that, a third party could be taking extra steps even though they're not required. But right now it's not a requirement, and so that is what we're speaking to here.
May I follow?
I also have something to add to that. Is that okay?
Yes, go ahead.
One of the things I think that to get at the question of the requirement or not requirement, it's less of is there a requirement for them to do so, and more so a question, as I understand it, as I've been looking at this for a while, that it's a question of who would provide oversight of that and what would that oversight look like. So if Ecology was required to provide oversight, perhaps it would be in the form of, you must submit this documentation to show you that's submitted that you engage communities in this way or that way. There's all kinds of ways you can engage the public, right? You can send out a mailer, you can hold town hall, you can go to a community event, but what we seem to kind of find, where the gap seems to be, is who would provide oversight of that and how, and because there seemed to be a gap there, that was the question that we were kind of digging into and trying to learn more about. Does that?
Well, it goes to my follow-up, which is you didn't include any discussion of the absolute unquestioned authority of Ecology to require a liable party to pay for all remedial actions. Remedial action includes public involvement, and therefore Ecology can either require the owner, operator, contributor to a contaminated site to conduct a public involvement plan that meets Ecology's requirements, or Ecology can step in and charge the liable parties, right?
Yes, I see what you're saying. So we did not look at, like, when they go to pay the liable parties or a developer or whoever it is, we didn't go and look to see, like, what documentation do you require? When we asked for documentation about the third-party managed sites, they were like, that's not really something we do. And so we didn't do, like, our methodology didn't consider, like, taking out some different applications for getting payment for cleaning up the third-party sites. It was more of, when we asked for community engagement documentation on these sites, we learned, oh, there's a gap here.
Right. So my takeaway from your number one takeaway from the audit is there is no public involvement program for most sites, A, but B, Ecology has authority to ensure that there is public involvement, but doesn't appear to use it.
And that could be another audit. We could look into it more. I think, like I said, this was kind of a thing that we were like, oh, this is interesting. And the way that we discovered it is because we had an original methodology, which you'll see in the back of the report. And when we tried to do that methodology, it didn't work because there wasn't the documentation that we had originally thought we would be able to pull. And so I think Ecology can answer some of these questions. I also know that some of the things that they've talked to us about are resource constraints, are, things like that make it challenging to take on that work for all of those sites. So, and that could always be another audit. It can be, I can't commit to it, of course, but those are things that we're always looking at when we kind of see something in an audit and we're like, this is interesting. We can always, my director is behind me, and I imagine my assistant director is too, and seeing your interest in this, I imagine, there's a question of what could that look like, or, maybe even just hearing this today kind of opens up that conversation a little bit more.
Thank you. It sure does.
And I just wanted to add one other thing to that. I think, too, with this, as we were looking at this, the requirements right now don't stipulate that third parties are required to do this, but this is one of the recommendations that we are making, that they do put this in place. And we talked about this with Ecology, that this can look different, the level of engagement, what they may look like, what Ecology's oversight might be with that. So it's something that we did discuss with them further and just talk through with them a little bit, recognizing that it's something that isn't currently in place right now, but something that they did, agree with, I think, overall, that this is an area where, especially where we focused on the higher risk sites, so those sites that are higher risk, should those have some further community involvement, and so that's what our focus was in this audit. Really, is Marisa went through the slides talking about those higher risk sites that we identified through the data and just acknowledging that. So, okay.
Representative Fye, did you have a question?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So this is like opening up proverbial Pandora's box, right? So in the last interim, I was dealing with a redevelopment of a site that was contaminated, and there was a large redevelopment proposed for that, and was handled by the local government. And I presume when you say third parties could be a local government in terms of being the ones either owning the property or having SEPA lead responsibilities for a particular projects, right? So this can frequently come up when there's a redevelopment and you have to make a determination about what the remedial action will be for that particular piece of property. And a few things about that. One, even with having some level of knowledge on my part with what agencies might be involved, it was difficult for me to sort out who has jurisdiction, who makes the decisions, what the state engagement is and authority is vis-a-vis the local government. And it was difficult for me, so it has to be really difficult for someone that doesn't play in governmental stuff the way that a legislator might. And then there's the other issue of whether the public engagement is meaningful or has any effect, right? I mean, there's probably, for many people who've dealt with this process, probably have some real question about whether the way they've been engaged, the way they've been notified is meaningful. And my experience has been it's always for a public member, they're always playing catch up because they don't get notified because there's varying responsibilities in terms of the geography of what people determine or are affected by, in this case, a redevelopment, but a sterile site that is not even proposed for redevelopment, it would probably be very difficult to make sure that there's adequate notice to the people who might be broadly affected. So I would just, I'm not going to ask you a question, but I think this, and I think the previous comments from the other members bear this out. This is something that's quite a bit deeper, and you're sort of hit the tip of the iceberg, but there's a whole lot more here to make sure that there's good notification, that the actual engagement is meaningful, that the notification occurs in a timely way and in a broad enough way to bring in people who have a concern. And this particular piece of property was certainly in what would be defined as an overburdened community. So the HEAL Act, of course, is important. So I just think that there's, for those, for you folks and your people that you work for, I think this bears out to be a broader item that would be worthy of further study by the State Auditor's Office.
Thank you so much for sharing. May I make a comment based on what you just shared? So I have a million thoughts running through my mind. One of the things is that when you're talking about the site, I think part of it is even we've asked Ecology, one of our recommendations is to make clear. They have a list, a database on their website, and you can kind of see like what team manages it and things like that. We've asked for them to disclose which sites are independent cleanups and which ones are not, because we think that transparency is important. So we made that recommendation. And another thing you said was the thing about even knowing who to contact. One of the things that we heard when we did some community outreach was we heard, you know, part of it is like the cleanup itself. Part of it is if there's a health risk. Part of it is like there's so many parties that are part of such a complex process, I suppose, that trying to figure out even who to contact, that is something we heard directly from members of the public, so it doesn't surprise me to hear you say that. And so I think one of the things that we had asked Ecology, and they seemed very receptive to it, was, you know, making sure they update contacts on their website for who people can contact. One of the things that I'm thinking about is that the way Washington currently learns about waste sites is that it's publicly reported. And so because it's reported by folks, there's a system where you can say, hey, I think there's a site near me. I'm wondering, that's one of the places where I'm wondering, you know, until Ecology has the resources, or there could be space there. And so I can definitely talk with, you know, my director, my assistant director, and folks at my agency to see where else could we look to kind of see where there might be other gaps too, or how these things are connected. Because as you say, this is a very big, complex thing. And so protecting the health and wellness of communities, especially vulnerable populations, we want to make sure that we're doing what we can. So I'll definitely talk with folks at my agency to see what else we can do.
So I do have a question. There's some terminology that's being used in here that I'm a little uncertain of. I'm not an auditor, so I don't know what these words mean in the auditing world.
Okay.
I just know what connotation they have to me.
Okay.
So when you talk about Ecology conducting or supervising cleanups for 8% of the active contaminated sites, and then you go on the next slide, that was slide 7, slide 8, you talk about more than half of the active contaminated sites are managed by third parties. And then in the graph, you have, you show the half that's managed by a third party, 493 by Ecology, 636 by EPA or another body, and 1,598 that there's no plan in place. So how many of these are actually currently actively being cleaned up?
That's a really great question. One, I want to just thank you so much. Figuring out how to explain the data we were looking at, oh man, internally we were like, do we do all the sites that are in the repository? Do we only include the ones that were cleaned up? And so this has been really a thing that we've talked about internally to try to convey things as clearly as possible.
Did the data need cleanup first?
You know, it looked pretty good to us. There were a few things like being able to see. The biggest thing actually was kind of knowing which sites are independent sites cleaned up by like a third party and which ones aren't. That was like really the thing with the data that we saw. But for the most part, it looked decent. But what I want to go back to your question. Oh my goodness, my mind just went blank.
Don't feel bad. It's hard for me to keep track of all of this as well. So
I remember the data.
The active contaminated sites
Yes.
versus managed by third parties versus what is actually being cleaned up.
Yes. Okay. So this is a great question. Thank you for, I'm getting older, so my brain is like, one, I got all this stuff in my head, but two, I'm just getting older, so it's like harder for me to remember all the things. But so when we talk about active contaminated sites, Ecology has like an indicator for if sites are still like going through the cleanup process, and figuring that out, what you just asked, is actually was kind of a challenging thing, because we were trying to figure out, when we were trying to develop our methodology, we were figuring out, okay, so when should community engagement happen? Obviously throughout the cleanup process, but which part within the process would be a really good indicator for us to kind of zoom in on? Would it be like before it gets cleaned up, after it gets cleaned up? And the way that it's kind of broken out with the different indicators that they have on there, it's kind of hard to tell, like, at what point is like it mostly cleaned up, but they have indicators in the data set that will say like this one is in construction, this one we're monitoring, this one it's in the early stages of us figuring out cleanup. So you can go on their website and it'll tell you what we have in terms of the active sites. Those are just all sites that hadn't been like closed out, like either a third party a third-party group had brought and said, okay, it's clean. Ecology looked at the paperwork and said, okay, we can close that one out. Or it was an Ecology conducted or supervised site, and they closed it out themselves. So all of the ones that were closed out, we did not include these in any of the numbers that you're seeing in the report, because those were already cleaned up. Those are like closed out.
Well, I guess what I'm trying to understand, you use the term active contaminated sites. Mm-hmm. So are you saying that there's an active case file on those contaminated sites as opposed to there's any activity actually going on those contaminated sites? I see.
I'm not really sure.
We would have to look at that further and get back to you on the details of that. I mean, we do have the information available in the data about whether the cleanup has started, and so that is acknowledged in the data set, but we'd need to go back to look at that specifically.
Yeah.
So when you're saying something is managed by a third party, there's active cleanup on those? Or just the property is managed by a third party?
So these would be for the sites that are third parties. These would be sites that third parties are going to be cleaning them up. They could be still awaiting cleanup. They could be in the process of being cleaned up. So it just depends on where they're at in the process. But when it says third party sites, those are sites right now that they're planned to be cleaned up by the third parties.
And then the 1,598 that there's no plan yet, whose jurisdiction are those?
So our understanding, this may be a really good question for Ecology. Our understanding is that once they kind of figure out how they're going to score the sites, I don't know if if you caught it, but we mentioned that they're changing how they score the sites. So the way that they used to score the sites was under one method, and now they're scoring it under a separate method. They're thinking, what they explained to us was, hey, once we get these sites scored, we'll have a much easier time figuring out, like, maybe the level of risk, or, you know, it helps us understand how to figure out a plan. Once they have those sites scored, and one of the things we talked about in the recommendations is for higher risk sites, like maybe Ecology would manage those, and then like lower risk sites could be cleaned up by a third party, or there's lots of different ways that that could look, but trying to figure out first, what are they scored? And then that will help Ecology figure out, should we try to have it go through an independent third party? Should we try to have it go through the VCP process, the voluntary cleanup program? Or should we take it on ourselves? That would be a really good question for them if they want to have any follow-up to that, but that's my understanding of why they're planless, but also what needs to happen in order for Ecology to figure out kind of how to route those sites. Did that answer your question?
I think, yeah.
Okay.
With that, I don't see any other questions. Thank you for your report. We do have some folks from Ecology. I believe they're here in the audience. If they'd like to come forward and make... You have one more question before the auditor's office leaves?
I'm sorry.
Go ahead, Representative Paul.
I realized I forgot to ask about the tribal engagement findings, which I was shocked to hear that, to read in the audit that Ecology, and this is something I wanted to ask you and then make sure Ecology follows up on, because I was shocked that it seemed that Ecology had difficulty identifying which tribes had treaty-protected resources in the areas affected by contaminated sites. That's not very hard to do, and but that should also trigger public involvement. And I'm just wondering, because not public involvement, tribal engagement, because every site that includes a restriction on resources has to have specific steps taken about the impact, what we call an exposure scenario. So I was wondering if you looked at whether Ecology is engaging with the tribes to utilize tribal exposure scenarios for those resources impacted by a contamination release.
We did not look at that in this audit. We did look to see if there was any type of engagement, but we did not go to that level of detail in this audit.
Thank you, and hopefully Ecology will follow up with that. Thanks.
Okay, you're welcome.
Thank you for your time.
Okay. Thank you for being here. Thank you for taking our questions. So we'll let the Department of Ecology come forward, make any comments, and then be prepared to take questions. When you're ready, please identify yourself and proceed.
Good afternoon, Vice Chair Orcutt and members of the committee. I'm Heather Bartlett, Deputy Director at Washington Ecology. Thanks for the opportunity to provide some remarks. Both the Departments of Ecology and Health appreciate the state auditor's work on this performance audit, and in particular, their collaborative approach through this project. It really has been a good opportunity for us to reflect on community engagement practices that we have at our agency. We're proud of the work that we've done to incorporate meaningful community and tribal engagement into cleanup projects that we manage, but we also recognize that we can improve even further in this work and look forward to using these audit findings to improve our practices. In fact, we have already put in place actions that we can take to implement some of the recommendations. It has been encouraging as we review the report to see the recommendations actually align with some of our ongoing efforts. We'll use these recommendations as part of our existing continual improvement processes and as resources allow. For example, we plan to enhance our engagement work by improving community research upfront as recommended, and then consistently evaluate its impacts, thinking in terms of lessons learned at the end of cleanups. We also look forward to expanding our collaboration with the Department of Health and then finding ways to more effectively work, in particular with local health jurisdictions, to engage with communities near these contaminated sites. As highlighted in the audit, Ecology oversees cleanup for about 8% of the contaminated sites in Washington, and these sites are where Ecology either conducts the cleanup or supervises the cleanup by another party under a legal agreement. And it is only at these sites that community and tribal engagement is required by the state's environmental cleanup law and regulation. However, as you have noted, and as was noted by the Auditor's Office, Washington currently has more than 6,000 active cleanup sites, and generally the entities that are associated with these are not required to do community engagement as part of the cleanup. We agree that community engagement opportunities should be the norm for higher risk cleanup sites, including those currently cleaned up by independently private parties. We'll develop a plan that annually identifies the highest risk sites and the resources needed to address them, including community engagement. And we will identify ways to use existing resources, including reprioritizing work, and then estimate additional resources that would be needed to do community engagement at cleanup sites that are done by others. We'll also incorporate recommendations into our existing public involvement processes to explore new ways to better understand community needs. And in fact, we have already developed guidance for staff on how to engage with the tribes. And this month, just actually last week, we rolled out a new system for the public to subscribe and then receive automatic email updates or notifications for any site when there is a change in the status of that site. Although we agree with the recommendations, some of them will require additional funding or staff resources to implement. This will be critical for the agency to fully implement all of the recommendations. Thank you again for the opportunity. We're encouraged by the findings, and then we also look forward to improving our engagement to benefit tribes and Washington communities.
Good afternoon. I'm Lauren Jenks. I'm Assistant Secretary for Environmental Public Health at the Washington State Department of Health. I just wanted to thank the auditor staff for the time spent with us and with the Department of Ecology, and just say we very much value our relationship with Department of Ecology and our partnership on these sites. I think it's helpful to have the auditor's office highlight that much of that is dependent on the people who we have in those positions, and as people move on and retire, we need to write that down and train our people on how that partnership works. And I appreciate having that pointed out, and look forward to working with the Department of Ecology on putting that together.
Michael, do you want to introduce yourself?
I'm Michael Felkamp. I'm with the Toxics Cleanup Program, a senior policy analyst. I'm here to help answer any questions you might have as well.
Okay, well, thank you for being here. Do members have any questions for Ecology or Department of Health? Representative Paulette?
I'd like to just ask you to respond, follow up on a couple of questions I asked to the State Auditor's Office, maybe working backwards so memory is fresher. Tribal engagement. MOTCA requires that if there's any site where the cleanup plan is going to restrict use of resources, which is pretty much every site these days, specific engagement steps, including with the tribes, because they have resources that they utilize much higher levels than others, and some that people who are not part of tribal culture may not utilize at all, including certain fish species, for example, or plants that uptake contamination. And the requirement in the rules is to engage specifically. So I'd like to ask, is Ecology going to be doing more to ensure use of tribal exposure scenarios in setting cleanup levels and plans and assessing the efficacy of cleanups?
Thank you for the question. We already, I would say, consider tribal exposure scenarios such as fish consumption at many of our sites quite frequently throughout Puget Sound. That's been done, and we're constantly looking at ways to make sure that we are appropriately reaching out to tribes to ensure that we are identifying what those exposure scenarios are so that we can appropriately address their particular land and resource uses. As part of, I think, this, the auditor's approach, that making sure that we take additional efforts at additional sites to make sure that we aren't missing sites that might impact those resources so that there aren't any gaps in that. So we're looking to, and that's going to be part of our, as was mentioned by the auditor, we've just recently rolled out earlier this year to implement the regulations, the tribal engagement plan and guidance for our staff, which also goes to one of your other questions related to outreach, which is making sure that all of the tribes that might have resources affected are being identified, in fact, casting a broader net out initially and letting the tribes tell us, not us determining for them, which sites or resources they are interested in, and telling us, yes, we want to be involved at this site and we have very specific concerns, or no, this doesn't impact our concerns. We want to have them tell us that, not the other way around.
May I ask, going to a different question then, you're revising the site hazard assessment SHARP program, and what strikes me, and I'd like to ask, there doesn't seem to be any discussion in your response about early public engagement in that, in terms of community engagement and ensuring, because as the first step of assessing sites, that's where, you know, whether or not an immigrant community is going to have much greater exposures, or a tribal community will have much greater exposures, and that determines the risk. So are you going to be doing extensive public involvement to along the same lines for that first step, which did not appear in your response?
I'll speak to maybe both tribal and community. Regarding tribal engagement, I was mentioned by the auditor, as part of both our new regulations and our guidelines, we set out the kind of timing early and upfront that we need to engage initially with tribes before there's any remedial investigation or interim action. In part, that's also to make sure that we are appropriately addressing any potential impacts on cultural resources. So before there's any field work, basically, that might be ground disturbing, we're reaching out. That's our, at least by then, if not sooner, our initial engagement. I'd also note that when we initially intake sites, and this applies both for tribal and community concerns, we're identifying sites that may be of higher risk under this new SHARP system. And we're looking to, and those assessments will be posted online so that when anyone looks at sites in their community, tribes are going to be looking at, can identify those sites as well that they might have concerns about, and they may have information about before even we do. For community concerns, I think one of our best practices that we're looking to implement moving forward too is making sure, consistent with how we are engaging tribes, is also how we engage communities, and making sure that we are appropriately engaging them earlier in the process. We already have requirements in a rule specific to timing, and that includes, certainly by the time we have a remedial investigation done and we want to get feedback from the community as to, did we miss anything? Are there any impacts to your land, to your resource uses that we did not already identify? So that's really up to now what's been the first step. If we determine based on our new SHARP assessments when we intake sites that there are potential current exposures that we need to alert the public about, even if it's a potential future exposure that it's not confirmed yet, we're going to take further steps to either request additional information so we can confirm whether there is a current exposure, or whether we need to get and maybe even work with the Department of Health to reach out to the community in those cases. And that's one of the benefits of doing this new SHARP assessment of all the sites, including those that are as they're intaked, as well as some of the legacy sites. We'll have a better handle on those that actually pose current threats as opposed to those that don't.
I just want to say I'm encouraged because in the response itself, I just want to say it talks only about using existing data, not engagement in creating the SHARP prioritization system. And so I encourage you to update that and to ensure that you are asking these questions for the prioritization, not just after you've said this site's of moderate risk, but it's only of moderate risk because the prioritization system used the DOH health disparities mapping tool only, for example, which covers where you live, but not the resources you use 20 miles away. So that's not an attack on the DOH mapping system. I mean, that's a comment that DOH has talked about how hard it is to do that. Yeah. Thank you.
Great.
Okay, any additional questions? Seeing none, thank you for coming forward.
Thank you.
We do have, this is a chance now to go to public testimony. We have one person signed up for public testimony. So if you could advance Katie Burns. And Katie, when you're ready, come off mute. Please turn on your camera if you can, and please proceed.
Thank you for the opportunity to provide comments today. My name is Katie Burns. I'm the Toxics and Stormwater Policy Senior Manager at Washington Conservation Action. For over 30 years, WCA has remained committed to defending and improving the Model Toxics Control Act by working to protect funding and ensure it benefits the communities who are most impacted by pollution. Over the last 5 years, we've worked with the Department of Ecology on rulemaking to update existing MOTCA regulations. And we focus specifically on addressing the disproportionate number of toxic sites in communities of color and in low-income communities that place unfair additional burdens on neighbors and neighborhoods. Ecology adopted input on the SHARP tool as it was developed, and now SHARP can be used to prioritize sites for cleanup based on community demographics, and it can also be used as a metric for tracking progress over time. State resources should be used to eliminate disparities, and community engagement is key to this process. We were interviewed for this audit, and we're grateful to the auditors for confirming the need to improve site-specific community engagement and plan for cleaning up these really high-risk sites in a timely manner. And this includes places like Yakima that have a disproportionately large number of sites, but no clarity on when they'll be cleaned up. We were tentatively awarded a grant to investigate effective community engagement techniques in Yakima, and we look forward to collaborating with Ecology as we learn what works best for this community. People deserve to know if they're living near a toxic site, but most do not. MOTCA is a largely unknown law, and as it was discussed here today, it can be difficult to find information, even if you know where to look for it. It is up to Ecology to ensure that community members are informed and engaged throughout this cleanup process. Fully funding MOTCA is necessary to achieve what Ecology has outlined in their response to this audit. We drafted a proviso to carry out additional work needed, and we look forward to refining it during the 2026 legislative session to make sure that Ecology has the resources it needs. And to do this work meaningfully at scale, Ecology will likely need these additional resources because standard approaches, including things like holding meetings during the day, often miss entire communities that may be impacted. Meeting people where they are will require more modern approaches and more human resources to carry them out. We're committed to continuing to work with Ecology, and we will continue to monitor the implementation of these programs. Thanks again for the opportunity to provide comments.
All right, and thank you. And I will let Katie know, as well as the rest of the public, that if they want to submit written comments, they are certainly welcome to do so. You can either submit comments to JLARC at leg.wa.gov. And if you just remember Legislature Washington Government, JLARC at leg.wa.gov. Or you can actually send in written comments in written form to P.O. Box 40910, again 40910, Olympia, Washington 98504. And with that, that concludes our business today. Thank you all for coming. We're adjourned.